My husband left me after I made an album for our 20th wedding anniversary and went to another woman, but he didn't know one very big secret. I spent weeks putting it together, a beautiful, handcrafted album capturing every milestone of our 20-year marriage. The wedding, the birth of our daughter, our first home, the vacations where we laughed until we cried. I imagined how Mark would react when he saw it, how he'd flip through the pages and remember the life we built together. But when I handed it to him that night, sitting across from me in our dimly lit living room, he barely spared it a glance before letting out a low chuckle. "This is pathetic, Emily," he muttered, shaking his head as he tossed the album onto the coffee table. "Do you really think this changes anything?" My heart clenched. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed, rubbing his temple as if I were a nuisance. "I'm leaving," he said simply, nodding toward the suitcase by the door. "I was going to wait until after dinner, but since you've already gone all sentimental on me, there's no point in dragging it out." I stared at him, my mind scrambling to process his words. "Leaving? What are you talking about?" "I'm done, Em," he continued, running a hand through his perfectly styled brown hair. "This marriage, it's over. It's been over for a while. I just didn't feel like dealing with your theatrics before now." I swallowed hard, the warmth of the cozy living room suddenly feeling suffocating. "This is a joke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We were supposed to go to Vero's tonight. I made a reservation." Mark let out a short laugh. "Yeah, I know. You always make reservations. Always planning, always trying to hold things together with little date nights and forced romance." His eyes darkened. "But I've moved on, Emily. I've been seeing someone else for almost a year now." The room tilted slightly as the words sank in. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Who?" He smirked, as if he was proud of himself. "You remember Claire? From the firm?" Claire. His assistant. The one who always made sure he had his coffee just right, who laughed a little too hard at his jokes, who, for the past several months, had been the reason he came home late reeking of floral perfume. "You're leaving me for her?" I asked, my voice shockingly even. "She's not like you," Mark said, grabbing his phone from the couch. "She's fun, spontaneous. She doesn't make every damn thing a scheduled event." He shrugged. "I'm moving in with her tonight. We'll stay at the Hilton until we get a place together." I exhaled slowly, my pulse steadying. "You were just waiting for the right moment to tell me, huh? Our anniversary seemed fitting." "Don't be dramatic, Em," he scoffed. "You knew this was coming." I stood, smoothing out the deep blue dress I had chosen for the occasion, the one he once said made me look mature, which I now realized was just a polite way of calling me old. My fingers brushed the edge of the album, my voice quiet. "You're right about one thing, Mark," I said, lifting it from the table. "This night isn't going the way I planned." His eyes flicked to mine, finally noticing the shift in my demeanor. "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled, a small, private smile, one he didn't recognize. Because Mark had no idea that hidden within the pages of that carefully curated album was a truth far more shocking than his pathetic little affair. Mark thought his announcement was the big reveal of the night. That he would watch me crumble, cry, beg him to stay. But what he didn't know, what he never even suspected, was that I had my own secret. 1 week ago, my life had changed forever. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I stopped at the gas station on my way home. I never played the lottery, but on a whim, I bought a ticket. I didn't even check the numbers right away. When I finally did, alone in the kitchen, under the dim glow of a midnight light, I nearly collapsed. The numbers matched. Every single one. $112 million. The realization hit like a freight train. I double-checked, triple-checked, convinced I was wrong. But I wasn't. It was real. My first instinct hadn't been to tell Mark. Instead, I called someone I could trust, really trust. Ellen Walsh, one of the top financial advisors in the city, answered on the second ring. By sunrise, we had a plan. Lawyers were involved, accounts were set up, protections were put in place. Not a single cent was in our joint name. Mark had no idea, and he never would. Which meant, as he stood there smugly in our living room, suitcase packed, thinking he held all the power, I was the one who was truly free. "So," Mark said, adjusting his cufflinks, "I assume you'll be a professional about this? We'll divide things up fairly, and you won't make this harder than it needs to be? I tilted my head. Fairly? You can keep the house, he offered magnanimously. I don't need it. Claire and I will get something new. How generous. And the accounts? I asked, feigning curiosity. He shrugged. I'll talk to a lawyer. We'll split them evenly. No need to drag this through court. I smiled again, running my fingers along the leather spine of the album. I see. Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it briefly, smirking. That's Claire. She's waiting downstairs. He met my gaze. So, we good? For the first time in years, I felt light. Weightless. We're good, I said. But before you go, there's something you should see. I flipped open the album and pulled out a crisp, official document, folded neatly between two pictures from our trip to Hawaii. The last trip we took before he started coming home late. His brow furrowed. What's that? I held it up, letting him get a good look. Just some paperwork from the State Lottery Commission, I said, savoring the moment. Mark frowned. Lottery? I nodded. You see, while you were sneaking around with Claire, I was winning $112 million. I watched as the color drained from his face, his lips parting slightly. You're lying, he whispered. I unfolded the letter completely, letting the official seal catch the light. I'm not. His eyes flicked from the paper to my face, then back again. For the first time all evening, Mark was speechless. Funny thing, I continued, stepping closer. In this state, lottery winnings are considered separate property if acquired before divorce proceedings begin. I tilted my head. Which means? He swallowed hard. Which means what? I smiled. Which means you get nothing, Mark. The suitcase slipped from his grasp, landing with a soft thud. And for the first time in 20 years, I truly enjoyed the silence. Mark had always been a man who prided himself on being in control. Every decision in our marriage, from where we vacationed to how we spent money, was dictated by his preferences. He called it leadership. I called it manipulation. And right now, standing in our living room with his suitcase packed, Mark was realizing, for the first time ever, that he had lost control. You're serious, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dead serious, I replied, holding up the official letter from the State Lottery Commission. Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind scrambling for a way out. A way to twist this in his favor. I could almost see the gears turning. $112 million, he murmured, more to himself than to me. After taxes, it's a little over 78, I corrected. His head snapped up. We should talk about this, Emily. We? I let out a soft chuckle. There's no we anymore, remember? You made that very clear when you packed your bags and decided to move in with Claire. His face hardened. You're being petty. Am I? I folded my arms, watching him like a scientist observes a failed experiment. You can't just keep all of it, he said, his tone shifting to something smoother. More persuasive. We built this life together. That money, it's part of our story. I raised an eyebrow. Funny. I thought our story ended about 20 minutes ago when you told me you were leaving. Mark took a slow step toward me, adjusting his stance like he was getting ready to argue a case in court. Listen, he said, slipping into his lawyer voice, the one he used when trying to charm clients or intimidate interns. I know this is a shock. And I know you're angry. But you don't have to do this. We can be fair about it. I tilted my head. Fair. Like how you fairly decided to cheat on me? Or fairly lied about those work trips that were actually weekends with Claire? He had the audacity to look insulted. Those were complicated situations, Em. You don't understand how hard. Stop. I held up a hand. You don't get to stand here and gaslight me into thinking your betrayal was just a complicated situation. You made your choices, Mark. And now, you get to live with them. His jaw tightened. The charm act had failed. Now came the threats. Fine, he snapped. Then I'll take you to court. You really think a judge is just going to let you walk away with all that money? I sighed, walking to the couch and sinking into the cushions. I had a feeling you'd say that. I reached into the album again, pulling out another set of documents. His eyes flickered with interest, but I saw it, the fear underneath. "What's that?" he demanded. "Just a little something my lawyer put together," I said, flipping through the pages. "You see, in preparation for tonight, I did some digging. And you, Mark, have been a very busy man." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure, you do." I handed him the papers. "Go on. Read it." Mark hesitated, then snatched the documents from my hand. As his eyes scanned the first page, his entire body went rigid. This is ridiculous," he stammered. "You've been embezzling money from your firm for the past 6 months, I said, my tone casual. "Transferring funds from client accounts into a business expansion fund that doesn't actually exist." His nostrils flared. "That's a lie." "No, Mark," I said, shaking my head. "It's bank statements. And financial reports. And receipts. All of which my lawyer has already sent to the firm's board of directors." He gripped the papers so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You're bluffing," he said, but the crack in his voice gave him away. "Am I?" I pulled out my phone, tapped a few buttons, and turned the screen toward him. His face drained of color. There, in my email inbox, was a message from Robert Keller, the managing partner at his firm. Subject: urgent, fraud investigation and immediate action required. I let the email sit there in front of him for a long, satisfying moment. "You were always so confident no one would notice," I said. "But, Mark, people notice. You just thought they were too stupid to put the pieces together." Mark set the papers down carefully, then dragged a hand over his face. He looked tired now. Not the powerful, confident man who had walked in here expecting to leave me behind. "You don't understand what you've done," he muttered. "There are other people involved. If this goes public—" "Oh, don't worry. It's already public." I smiled sweetly. "The firm is preparing a full report as we speak. And once the board reviews the evidence, I doubt they'll just let you walk away with a nice severance package." His mouth opened, then shut again. "And if they decide to press charges," I added, tapping my chin thoughtfully, "well, you might be facing more than just a job loss." Mark looked around the room as if searching for an escape. "You're ruining my life," he whispered. I shrugged. "No, Mark. You ruined your life. I'm just finally stepping out of its way." His phone buzzed on the table. We both glanced at it. "Claire." Mark let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "I can't believe this." "You better believe it," I said, standing. "Because in about an hour, Robert Keller will be calling you personally. And I have a feeling that conversation won't go quite the way you'd like." Mark reached for his suitcase, his movements sluggish, like a man walking to his own execution. "Where are you going?" I asked innocently. "I thought you were staying at the Hilton with Claire." He shot me a glare. "This isn't over." I smiled. "Oh, Mark. It's so over." I watched as he grabbed his suitcase and headed for the door. Just as he reached it, he hesitated. "Emily," he said, turning slightly. "I never meant for things to end like this." I nodded. "And yet, here we are." For a second, I thought he might say something else, some desperate, last-ditch attempt at saving face. But instead, he sighed, opened the door, and disappeared into the night. And just like that, he was gone. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. The house was quiet now, empty in a way that should have felt lonely. But instead, for the first time in years, I felt nothing but relief. The silence in the house was different now. Not the cold, suffocating kind I had grown used to over the years, the kind that had crept into our marriage like an uninvited guest. No, this silence was freeing. Cleansing. I stood in the middle of our living room, staring at the abandoned coffee table where Mark's favorite glass of bourbon used to sit. It was strange how quickly a presence could become a memory. Just hours ago, Mark had been here, thinking he was in control, believing he could toss me aside like yesterday's news and walk into a new life with Claire. And now? Now, his world was unraveling. I wandered toward the kitchen, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. Reaching for a bottle of wine, I poured myself a glass and took a slow sip, savoring the taste of victory. Mark's departure should have left me broken. That was what he expected, what men like him always expected from women like me. But instead of drowning in heartbreak, I felt something entirely new. Relief. I didn't have to pretend anymore. No more forced smiles, no more waiting up at night, wondering if he'd come home at all. No more biting my tongue while he spent our money recklessly or belittled me with backhanded compliments disguised as concern. I was free. I walked back to the couch, picked up the photo album, and flipped through the pages. Each picture told a story, a love that had once been real, then slowly eroded by deception, selfishness, and greed. But those pictures no longer held power over me. I ran my fingers along the hidden pocket inside the album, the one where I had carefully tucked away the document that changed everything. Winning the lottery had been an accident. A cosmic joke, maybe. But securing my future? That was intentional. That was me finally taking charge of my life. And Mark had no idea just how deep his problems ran. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of calls and messages, none of which I answered. Then, at precisely 10:12 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, I picked up. Emily. Robert Keller's voice was as crisp as ever, but there was an edge to it, a barely restrained anger simmering beneath the surface. "Good morning, Robert," I said, sipping my coffee. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He exhaled sharply. "I assume you already know why I'm calling." I leaned back in my chair, smiling. "I might have a guess." "Mark's in my office right now," Robert continued, his voice tight. "He's trying to explain why hundreds of thousands of dollars are missing from company accounts. Why client funds were funneled into a non-existent business venture under his name." I let the silence stretch between us before replying. "And what's his explanation?" Robert let out a dry chuckle. "He's scrambling, Emily. He's trying to blame clerical errors, miscommunication, even you." I raised an eyebrow. "Me?" "He says you set him up. That you must have planted false evidence or manipulated the accounts." I nearly laughed. "Wow. That's creative." Robert sighed. "Listen, I'm calling because I wanted to thank you. If you hadn't sent me that information, we wouldn't have caught this in time. The board is meeting this afternoon, and let's just say Mark's future at the firm is looking bleak." "I imagine so." "You did the right thing," he said after a pause. "He's been reckless for a long time. We should have seen it sooner." People had seen it. They just hadn't wanted to deal with it until it became a problem too big to ignore. "Keep me updated, Robert," I said, glancing at the clock. "Oh, and one more thing." "Yes?" "If Mark tries to pin this on me again, remind him that all of his financial transactions were logged under his personal credentials. Last I checked, I don't have access to his work accounts." Robert let out a small chuckle. "Noted." I ended the call, setting my phone down. It was happening. The walls were closing in on Mark, and I wasn't lifting a single finger to stop it. By late afternoon, my doorbell rang. I already knew who it was. I took my time walking to the door, letting Mark stew on the other side. When I finally opened it, he was standing there, looking disheveled. His usually pristine suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened. He wasn't the confident, smug man who had walked out on me the night before. He was a desperate man watching his world collapse around him. "Emily," he started. "Can I come in?" I leaned against the doorframe. "Why?" "Because we need to talk." I tilted my head, pretending to think. "See, that's interesting. Because last night, when I wanted to talk, you dismissed me like I was some needy ex who couldn't take a hint." His jaw tensed. "That was before. Before you realized you were losing everything?" I finished for him. "Before you found out that I wasn't the pathetic wife you thought I was?" Mark sighed. "Can we not do this? Please?" I studied him for a moment. "Fine. Say whatever it is you came here to say." He took a deep breath, as if preparing for a performance. "I made a mistake," he said. "I let things get out of hand, and I wasn't thinking clearly. But Emily, we have a history. We've built a life together. That has to mean something." I smirked. "You mean like the history you built with Claire?" His expression darkened. "That was different." I let out a laugh. "Oh, I'm sure it was." Mark ran a hand through his hair. Look, I know I screwed up, okay? But we can fix this. We? I repeated. That's interesting. Because last I checked, we didn't exist anymore. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice dropping to something more urgent. You don't have to throw me to the wolves. I folded my arms. Mark, you threw yourself to the wolves. You stole from your company. You cheated on me. You gambled away our savings. You did this. Not me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and winced. Claire. You should answer that, I said. She's probably wondering why her big successful man hasn't secured their dream life yet. His hand tightened around the phone. You're enjoying this, aren't you? I smiled. More than I ever expected. Mark took a shaky breath. If you won't help me, will you at least keep the details of our finances quiet? If word gets out about the fraud, I could go to jail. I blinked. Mark. I sent the evidence to your company. His face paled. You. Yes, I said, nodding. And I hope they prosecute you for every cent you stole. His hands curled into fists, but he said nothing. I took a step back, gripping the edge of the door. Goodbye, Mark. Emily, wait. I shut the door in his face. And just like that, the last piece of my past was locked out of my future. I expected Mark to linger outside the door, pounding on it, demanding I open up. But after a few seconds of silence, I heard the sound of his retreating footsteps. He was finally gone. I stood there for a moment, exhaling slowly. The weight of 20 years lifted from my shoulders in an instant. I hadn't realized how heavy it had been until now, until I could finally breathe without waiting for the next insult, the next betrayal, the next disappointment. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself another glass of wine, and took my time enjoying the taste. The sun had started to set, casting a golden glow through the windows. It felt symbolic, in a way. One chapter closing, another waiting to be written. My phone buzzed. I picked it up, seeing a message from my financial advisor, Ellen Walsh. It's official. Everything is locked in. Your accounts are secure, and the firm has filed the fraud report against Mark. If he was hoping for an easy escape, he won't get it. Enjoy your evening. You deserve it. I smirked, setting the phone down. Yes, I did deserve it. Over the next week, the fallout from Mark's actions played out like a slow-motion car crash. First came the termination. The firm didn't even wait for a full investigation before cutting ties with him. The financial records I provided were damning enough, and when the board met, the decision was unanimous: Mark was out. Next came the legal trouble. The firm's attorneys wasted no time forwarding their findings to the authorities. Fraud. Embezzlement. Misuse of client funds. The charges weren't official yet, but it was only a matter of time. And then, as if the universe decided to add insult to injury, Claire dumped him. I wasn't surprised. She had signed up for a future with a wealthy, successful man, not a disgraced fraud facing criminal charges. Word got around fast in their social circle, and by the end of the week, Claire had moved out of her apartment and ghosted Mark completely. When I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was crashing at a cheap motel, I almost felt bad. Almost. 1 month later, I received an envelope in the mail. The return address? The state prison. I laughed, already knowing who it was from. For days, I debated whether to open it. What could Mark possibly have to say? An apology? A desperate plea for help? In the end, curiosity won. Inside was a letter, long, rambling, filled with regret. He wrote about how he had made mistakes, how he had been blinded by greed, how he never truly appreciated what we had until it was gone. He claimed he had found clarity in prison, that he wanted to make amends. Then came the real reason for the letter. I know you're doing well. I heard about the foundation you started. Maybe when I get out, we can find a way to work together. I'd like to give back, to do something meaningful. Please consider it. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Even in prison, Mark was looking for an angle. A way to manipulate. A way back into my life. I shredded the letter without replying. Winning the lottery had given me freedom, but it was what I did with it that truly mattered. 2 months after Mark's downfall, I officially launched my foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping women escape financial entrapment and abusive relationships. It was something I wished had existed when I was trapped in my marriage, feeling powerless, feeling like there was no way out. Now, I could make sure other women had a choice. A future. A second chance. The work was fulfilling in ways I never could have imagined. I met women who reminded me of myself, who had been told they were nothing without their husbands, who had been left with nothing when the men in their lives discarded them. Watching them rebuild, seeing their confidence return, that was more rewarding than any amount of money. And as my foundation grew, so did my personal life. One evening, at a charity event, I found myself in conversation with a man named Daniel Carter, a philanthropist who had donated generously to our cause. He was intelligent, kind, and most importantly, nothing like Mark. Over the months, we grew closer. Unlike my past, there were no power games, no manipulation, no walking on eggshells. For the first time in my life, I was in a relationship that felt equal. And I refused to take that for granted. 1 year after Mark walked out of our home, I found myself in my new beachfront house, watching the waves roll in. The desert heat of our old life was a distant memory now, replaced by the salty ocean breeze and the sound of seagulls in the distance. A framed picture sat on my desk, not of my past life, but of my new one. In the photo, I stood in front of the foundation's headquarters, surrounded by the women we had helped. Women who had found their own paths to freedom. Sometimes, I thought about the photo album that started it all, the one I had created as a tribute to a marriage that never truly existed the way I thought it had. The album that Mark had laughed at, called pathetic. That album was now on display in an exhibition about financial fraud and domestic abuse. A small plaque beneath it read, "Sometimes the strongest chains are the ones we think we can't break." I smiled, raising a glass of wine to my own reflection. "Here's to breaking chains," I whispered. And never looking back. Thank you for watching the video, like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.